Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture for business in Africa. I am Christy. On the agenda, tourism is the focus of our panel of experts. It's a vital sector for Africa's economies. But how well are we doing considering that more tourists visit the Spanish city of Barcelona every year than they do the African continent? Former Zimbabwe President Robert Mugabe was rushed to Singapore for medical treatment at the weekend. Although there is no suggestion he is at death's door, we will ask an analyst what impact his eventual demise will have on the fortunes of Zimbabwe, if any. And in the commodity corner, the focus is on wheat. But first, South Africa's state capture inquiry is today examining the relationship between the Gupta family and the financial sector. Joining us from the commission is Karabo Letlhlatlha. Karabo, in many ways, this is where the rubber touches the road. To move billions of dollars offshore surely requires the complicity of the financial sector, does it?
Christy, you are absolutely correct. There is no way that the Guptas could have siphoned billions worth of South African rands out of the country without some complicity. But I think what we're seeing here in the case of state capture is really just the banking sector, South Africa's big four banks, stepping up to the fore and saying that we tried to stop and deter the state capture from happening as soon as we know it. Now, the crux of the day really was how did Standard Bank just unilaterally decide to close those accounts? And it wasn't just Standard Bank, Standard Bank was actually following on the other big four which had closed the Gupta accounts earlier. But the problem here is that there was a political interference with that decision. Standard Bank went into lengths to say that they had a politically exposed client in Ghana, which landed them in trouble with the American and the United Kingdom authorities, and that they had to serve a 3-year probation based on that politically exposed relationship, and that they were trying simply to not repeat the case with the Gupta brothers. And as soon as they saw that this could really compromise the bank, that the risks outweigh the reward, they unilaterally decided to terminate those banks. And I think this is South Africa's banking sector coming to the fore, saying that we had nothing to do with the enablement of the Guptas in looting of the state or moving of their money. And right now, the African National Congress, the ruling party in South Africa, stands accused. Basically, it has been implicated today as using their political power to try and influence the financial sector as to taking which client and whom or whom not they cannot close the accounts off.
When some of Africa's presidents need medical treatments, they tend to avoid their own healthcare systems and use the country's fiscus for their own private healthcare outside of the continent. Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari favors British private hospitals. Former Angolan President Eduardo dos Santos goes to Spain, while Benin's President Patrice Talon opts for Paris. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe patronizes Singapore's clinics. Yesterday, the 94-year-old was flown in a chartered jet to Singapore for emergency treatment. Joining us from Harare is Institute for Security Studies analyst Derek Matizak. Welcome to the show, Derek. Now, the regular and constant medical excursions to Singapore does suggest that Mugabe's condition is worse than the official version that is just getting treated for cataracts, is it?
Yes, nobody's really believed the story about the cataracts. The cataracts might have been a factor, but Mugabe has been seen at one of the world's top oncology centers in Singapore, and it's generally assumed that he's being treated for cancer, probably prostate cancer.
Derek, Mugabe has dominated Zimbabwe's landscape since independence from Britain in 1980. Although no longer president following last year's coup, what impact would you say his death have on the country's future? Will it allow for Zimbabwe to begin a new chapter, really?
Not really. The new chapter in Zimbabwe really began in November with the swearing in of Emmerson Mnangagwa as the interim president pending elections. So that was really the end of the Mugabe era. Mugabe is something of a spent force politically now, though he does command a lot of media attention. So in that regard, he still has some political influence because the world pays attention when Mugabe speaks, and obviously Mnangagwa is anxious that Mugabe says positive things about him. But apart from that, Mugabe's influence is very insignificant at the moment.
To follow up on your thoughts on that, considering that Emmerson has indeed spent decades working with Zimbabwe in his own cabinet, to what extent would you say the country is enjoying the newness that it actually does aspire to?
Well, the attention now is focused on the economy, now that elections are out of the way. And the big question is whether the Mnangagwa administration is going to be able to attract the desperately needed foreign direct investment into the country. Mnangagwa had stated that investment would come in now that the Mugabe era was finished. It didn't arrive. It was then said that the investment would come once the elections were out of the way and there was some political stability in the country. So we now wait to see whether that promise will be fulfilled or whether there are other more serious structural factors keeping investment away from the country. So that's really the concern for the country at the moment. Of course, we are grappling now with a cholera epidemic, which is directly related to the lack of service delivery caused again by the lack of funds by government. And government needs the country to recover economically to stop these kind of ancient diseases recurring in Zimbabwe.
Within Zimbabwe's current political dynamics, what would you say are the chances for Grace Mugabe? What's the future for her?
Well, there's a sort of game going on at the moment between Mnangagwa and the Mugabe family. Whenever the Mugabe say something negative about Mnangagwa, he puts the squeeze on. Their pension benefits are slow in coming. When the Mugabe say something positive about Mnangagwa, then benefits and pensions start flowing their way. As we've seen recently, Mnangagwa facilitated the return of Grace Mugabe from Singapore to be able to attend her mother's funeral and has flown her back again, and indeed Robert Mugabe back again to Singapore for medical treatment. It seems that the Mugabes have now understood what's expected of them and will be making or giving positive signals about the Mnangagwa administration.
Derek Matizak is an analyst at the Institute of Security Studies. After maize, wheat is the most cultivated staple food in the world and the world's most traded crop. Joining us to discuss wheat's prospects is ABSA agricultural economist Conse Moraba. Conse, welcome to the show. Now, on the Chicago market, wheat prices had seen prices go up. What caused this, really?
So the global market has been identified for the past few years with a global abundant stocks in terms of wheat due to just a lot of supply that has not been moving. But in the recent season, we've seen that Australia had a drought. And I mean, Australia is the third largest exporter in terms of wheat. That shortage of production is supporting prices. As well as Canada, also a major wheat producing country, also had some weather related issues that led to crop losses. So those weather those crop losses had caused a bit of a reduction in stocks, therefore supporting prices. And that's why we've seen that wheat prices globally have been supported recently.
So what specifically would you say are the drivers of this relatively low production of wheat at this time?
It is weather. In South Africa, we've seen that over the past 10 years, wheat production has reduced by more than 50%. But in our South African local market, it has been because of profitability of other crops, mainly your soybeans and sunflower and maize. So our production, for instance, in the Free State in the Northwest had moved more from wheat and to those crops. So in South Africa, wheat production is lower than it has been in years. And last year there was a drought, wheat production was even lower, but this year we've had very good rains, especially in the Swartland area. We had exceptional good rains. The industry is expecting above average yields. The Overberg area is also expecting very good rains, and we're expecting good yields. So locally, we are expecting increased production in wheat. Globally, as much as there is a shortage in Australia and Canada, the Black Sea region also had amazing season. So the wheat globally is still a lot. It will just be a short-term support in terms of prices. And the low production globally will also be weather dependent, especially for the Australian market. But in South Africa, we see a different story.
Thank you, Conse. After the break, a discussion on tourism in Africa and if enough is being done to capitalize on the sector. Welcome back. According to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, in the first 6 months of 2017, there were 901 million tourists arriving at destinations. The strongest year-on-year growth was recorded by Africa with a 9% increase, followed by increases for Europe, Asia and the Pacific, all at 6%. Can tourism growth be sustained on the continent? In Lagos, I am joined in studio by the Managing Director of the W Hospitality Group, Trevor Ward. In Kigali by Rica Rwigamba, the Program Manager for the Mastercard Foundation. And in Johannesburg by spokesperson for the Gauteng Tourism Authority, Barba Gaoganediwe. So I'll start with you, Trevor, in studio with me in Lagos. Your thoughts on Africa's effort at harnessing tourism at this point?
Tourism is a short word, but a very big industry, and you really need to cut it down. And of course, also generalizing about 54 countries in Africa. Some countries do very well with international tourism, which is the figures you've just been quoting, which are very measurable, if you like, and those are the ones that are quoted. Here in West Africa, certainly in Nigeria, a huge amount of domestic tourism. Not a lot of international tourism, although of course tourism includes business visitors. So a lot of business people coming into Nigeria, not a lot of international leisure seekers, vacationers, but the domestic movement of people, tourists in Nigeria is huge. It's not measured. It's very difficult to measure it, but somebody going back to their village for a celebration and staying overnight is a tourist. So this movement of people domestically, which isn't being measured, is vast. Of course, sticking with West Africa, Gambia has a very large amount of international tourism. Senegal has some, Ghana has some, Cote d'Ivoire has some. We all have a little bit, but don't forget that tourism is also domestic people, and they are creating jobs and spending money when they move domestically.
Let's go to Rica now in Kigali to hear what he has to say. Rica, why do you think Barcelona is attracting more tourism than the whole of Africa is?
Well, I think it's maybe to follow up on what Trevor is talking about. It's really we've seen a growth. So while you may not see the numbers as many as Barcelona, but I think one has to look at the trends. And I think as far as the trend is concerned, you really see that Africa is developing and growing. The tourism is really growing. I think it's generally a newer concept in the region, but definitely on a growing trend. If I take the example of Rwanda, with the new report that was shared, 1.5 million tourists arrived in Rwanda in 2017. And tourism continues to be very much a big sector as far as export is concerned. In terms of services, it represented about 50% of all the service exports. But I also think that we are seeing the same trend. While the international tourists coming from Europe and the US is still a big market, but we are seeing really that there's a lot of change in terms of Africans that are traveling. So again, based on this report, 88% of the tourists and the visitors who came to Rwanda were coming from the African market. So I think it's really something that we're seeing. It's something that has been happening over the last decade, and it's growing as well. And I think this speaks to the new travelers onto the continent and the market that we need to probably be tapping more into.
Barba in Johannesburg, time to bring you onto the conversation. Now, if you look at two specific areas of tourism across the world, health and, of course, education are two key sectors of tourism that seems to attract the attention of Africans away from the continent to other countries in Europe. In terms of policies, to what extent would you say Africa is working on keeping Africans at home or maybe attracting tourism to the continent in those areas?
Indeed, we are still far lagging behind. If you look at Johannesburg and South Africa in particular, very well developed in terms of medical tourism offerings. In Johannesburg and in Gauteng in particular, we have over 2 million university students, excluding the lecturers and the other academic staff. That's a sizable number that can be harnessed and be capacitated into an offering that can make travel in the continent much more viable. So we need to be harnessing this low-hanging fruit, especially medical tourism, especially the education part that is there. The reality is that where tourism happens, where travel happens, trade is bound to happen. And with Africa being the fastest growing market and with a young population, I think surely working together as partners, we can really harness this. And in many years to come, we can even outstrip those Barcelona numbers that you have mentioned, Christy.
Rica, speak to us on the current trends in tourism in East Africa, Kenya particularly. To what extent would you say that the government is formulating policies to grow that sector of its economy?
I think maybe if I look at the whole East Africa, there's been a one of the successes, I think, of tourism in East Africa has also been how do we package as a region. If I take a recent development at policy level, the introduction of the East Africa tourist visa, which allows an international traveler coming from anywhere really outside of the continent, but also on the continent, to get access to 3 countries by just paying $100 visa fee and having access to Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. This really shows that the leadership of the East African countries have realized that well, we can all look at individual countries, but we really become stronger when we come together, because a tourist is really looking at how much can I see in a certain period of time, the shortest possible. So being able to offer an array of a diversity actually makes it more attractive. And maybe even to your point, instead of looking now Barcelona, we will not be competing, the competition won't be between Barcelona and Kigali or with Mombasa, but it will really be about the 3 countries and being able to see the wildlife, the culture, some of the conferences that are happening as well on the continent, and combining that with some leisure, and now gives us a competitive advantage. And I think this is what we have seen happening in East Africa, and that is definitely also helping us attract visitors, because we have a bigger we have a menu, basically, of different destinations, and that makes us quite attractive.
Rica has highlighted a very important point, which is working together. Now, there is only so much to be done locally within Africa, talking about formulation of policies, as Rica and Barba spoke about earlier. Now, Trevor, you have a deep understanding of the hospitality sector as well as tourism. What can Africa do better than it is doing now in terms of attracting foreign investments and maybe also empowering local investors to look into that sector?
It's difficult. Tourism is a risky business. It's not for the faint-hearted. But at the same time, there's a huge amount of tourism investment worldwide. What can governments here do? They can recognize that tourism creates jobs. If you look at the budgets that governments give to their tourism ministry or whatever you call it, it's pitiful. It really is very, very small, because they just see it as a private sector industry primarily, which can get on with it. Without government support, we're not going to get investors. We're not going to get the joined up government that we need. Rica mentioned visas. It's expensive to get a visa to many West African countries. Some are a visa on arrival, like Senegal and like Mali. Ghana and Nigeria, which are 2 of the biggest countries here. Nigeria used to have a visa on arrival, but they've suspended it whilst they get their act together. in any event, to get a visa on arrival, you had to apply in advance. So you couldn't just turn up on a whim and say, I want to go and see the Durbar.
So, Trevor, you're all about lowering the immigration barriers as a way to fast-tracking interest from local and foreign investors into tourism and hospitality in Africa.
It's not just the immigration barriers, it's also the doing business. If you look at the World Bank's doing business surveys each year, we're really not doing terribly well. Most of the countries in West Africa, which is where I specialise, but actually doing business here, getting your license to import capital, for example, it is a lengthy process, and it doesn't need to be a lengthy process. Getting government authorities to make any decisions is far too slow to be attractive to the private sector.
Lowering immigration barriers. Barba, now we come to you. How much of a peculiar situation, if you consider it as that, is this for you in South Africa, especially when you consider the country's current war against xenophobia?
It's almost the same in every region or every country in the continent. Tourism is one of those avenues that enables us to fight scourges like xenophobia, encourage social cohesion, and make sure that there is also intertrade and cultural exchange in the continent. So efforts that have been taken in East Africa needs to be replicated here in the south part, with SADC playing a crucial role in creating uni-visas and related legislative environment that will enable visitors to explore. We are now in the modern day moving actually away from the term tourism. We're embracing what is referred to as the visitor economy, so that we're able to embrace even the domestic market that offers us a lot in terms of per capita income. Johannesburg, South Africa, and Gauteng has the highest per capita income, and it's one of the major exporters of domestic travel to regions like Botswana, Angola, Lesotho in the region. And how do we get those countries to reciprocate? Because visitors really don't care about boundaries and political boundaries. They want integrated experience. So Trans-Africa Park examples are some of those things that can enable us to integrate our offerings and provide a fulfilling experience for our visitors, especially those that are in the region domestically, and that will empower us to welcome more international arrivals, with us knowing very well our own backyard, our own continent, and our own region.
While Trevor highlighted lowering immigration standards for efficiency and attracting local and foreign investors. Now, Rica, final word from you. What should Africa do differently?
I think definitely we need to realize that we are not competing among ourselves. We're really competing with the world. I think it's also important for us to look at this closed market. Statistics show that people travel nearby. Like, it's not just here in Africa. But I think one of the challenges that we have, we're still very much looking at international travel, understanding what the Europeans and the Americans want. And from the private sector perspective, I think it's also an opportunity to now understand these new travelers, the middle income, the Africans that are traveling, what do they really want to see in our countries? I think this is a market that is still quite untapped. And I hope that our private sector, of course, working with the government by easing all the visa and doing business in the region, but also the private sector needs to really come on board and tap into this market and to be able to develop products, tourism products and experiences that really meet the needs of this upcoming market, because it's there, it's next door, but I don't think we're taking full advantage of it.
Thank you. This is a conversation that will definitely continue over time, and that's where we leave it on the show today. Thank you to my guests. Join us again on Capital Connection on Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time. Good night.